Is Judaism the source of Eastern mystical religions? Will the Messiah replace the law of the Bible? And is God's law supposed to make sense? This is Rabbi Yossi Madvig, and you're listening to Jews Did It First. You may have noticed the absence of the regular theme music. That's because YouTube didn't seem to like it, some copyright issues. I had permission to use it, but I don't want to keep using it since I'd like to eventually, maybe monetize the podcast, and I don't need to give them any excuses not to. That's why I thank you so much for tuning in. Please subscribe, leave a review. If you're on YouTube, click the notifications button, ring that little bell so you know when things come up. Also, if you'd like to donate to help contribute to the podcast, please go to jewisoswego.org/Jews Did It First and click on the Make a Donation button in the upper right-hand corner. It's linked down below also. So, piggybacking off of last week's multiculturalism theme, I want to travel east. You may be unaware of this, but even though Judaism is considered one of the big three Western religions, it's actually a very mystical religion, and it shares a lot in common with Buddhism and Hinduism, which are considered Eastern religions. Some examples are reincarnation, meditation, levels of heaven, pressure points. I know what you're thinking. What? Judaism believes in all of that? Not only do we believe in it, I'd argue that Jews did it first. In the Torah, Genesis 25 to be exact, Abraham has sons born from a concubine after the birth of Isaac. In the Bible, it explains that he gives them gifts and sends them to the east. What are these gifts? Where to the east? The Bible doesn't say. Well, if you look in the Zohar, page 99 to 100, also in the Talmud, Sanhedrin 91, it tells us some of the information that is left out of the biblical narrative. We know what east means, right? Abraham lived in Israel, so east means anywhere from modern-day Jordan to, say, India and China. And that's exactly what it says in the Zohar, that especially India, but possibly China as well. It seems that they and their descendants spread in all of these areas, shared these quote-unquote gifts with the locals. Well, the gifts, the Zohar and the Talmud explain, are the divine names associated with impurity. That doesn't mean that the names of God or that there are names of God that are impure. It just means that you don't have to be in a state of tahara or ritual purity to say or use them. These spiritual secrets involve the manipulation of natural energies and prayer and meditation and all these things. This includes supernatural healing and other things also. Unfortunately, the people with these secrets began to apply them to their idolatrous beliefs and thereby corrupting the original teachings. However, there are still some interesting similarities between the Jewish and ancient Indian and Chinese belief systems. There's also some very intriguing historical coincidences. Of course, I don't believe in coincidences. As I always say, coincidence is an 11-letter name of God. I know you're sitting there counting right now. Some of the more superficial, but still pretty cool similarities are ones that have linguistic or historical parallels. One thing I saw mentioned that the ancient Chinese attribute great wisdom given to them from giants from far away. It could be that Middle Eastern people were a bit bigger, but you could also interpret that as spiritual giants. It's interesting. Not divine revelation, but someone from a distant land, giants from a distant land. It depends on when you count the beginning of Chinese culture, but the first dynasty seems to be around when Abraham was alive, around 2000 BCE or so. approximately 4,000 years ago, a little before that. Also, there are some remarkable similarities between the location of the body where Jews put on tefillin, right on our forehead and our arms. The tefillin are the black leather boxes that we wear during prayer. So there's an interesting correlation there, some similarity between where we put those on, on our body, and the Chinese acupuncture points, which are said to help give you pure and spiritual thoughts. So those are some similarities to the Chinese. I thought they were interesting. Could it be from these gifts, these teachings that were given from Abraham's descendants? Possibly. Even more interesting, I think, are the Hindu similarities. And I want to go over some of those. There's quite a bit. We'll just go over a few. It's interesting to note that the higher caste system, I don't know if it's caste or caste. I always see it spelled with an E at the end, which seems that it should be caste, but I always hear it pronounced caste. So whatever, I don't really care. If I say it wrong, forgive me. So the caste system in India, the higher one doesn't, intermarry with the so-called lower caste, and they're called the Brahmins. Now, if you just add an A to that, then it becomes the Abrahmins, which Abram was the name of Abraham before he became Abraham. Before that, that H sound was added to his name later on. And this could indicate that relationship between these descendants, these children from Abraham that came to the east as mentioned in the Bible. Also, there are some interesting linguistic similarities between Hebrew and the people of the Indus, as it were. For example, Hindu itself, or Indus, Hindu comes from the word Indus, because of the Indus River, and it means from the river. The river was called Indus, and Abraham was called the Ivri, the Hebrew, which means from over the river. That's kind of cool. Vedas is knowledge. Vedas, this is their knowledge that they have. The books are written, the Vedic texts, I believe. But anyway, Vedas means knowledge. And the word in Hebrew, das, also means knowledge. Also pretty cool. Going on this knowledge theme, one of the kids that was sent by Abraham was called Avida. Now, also interesting is that a camp in Hinduism is called an ashram. Well, according to Rashi, who was one of the primary commentators on the Bible in the 11th century, one of the sons' names, which is Ashurim, means a camp. Ashram, Ashurim. There's other linguistic similarities as well. So all of these little hints and clues and things like that seem to really indicate that there was this connection between the biblical story of Abraham sending his sons with these spiritual gifts to the east and the culture that developed, the religious culture and so on, that developed in the east, in India and perhaps China. Just to give you some background here of the things that I mentioned, right? We mentioned meditation. Judaism meditation is very big. The concept of meditating is mentioned in many of the mystical texts, in the Zohar especially. And it's not the sort of Eastern type of meditation that we're familiar with, where you empty yourself and you empty your mind and you become nothing. Really, the concept in Jewish meditation is to focus on a single idea, to focus on whether it's a verse of the Torah or a spiritual concept, say the infinity of God or something along those lines, and really understand it deeply and focus on it and meditate on that concept. Reincarnation, there's actually a whole book called Sefer HaGilgulim, which is the book of reincarnations, and it mentions various people who were reincarnated from other people, and that's also quite interesting. And levels of heaven, in the Buddhist tradition, I believe it is, or maybe it's the Hindu. I don't know. I get them all confused now. There's sort of levels of these spiritual worlds where, your soul becomes more refined, and I think eventually you get up to be like a god or something like this, and you have lots of influence. Now, that's very interesting. not so much the God part, but just this idea that your soul becomes refined and comes to a higher and higher level in reincarnation. That's the whole idea. The reason that, according to Judaism, a person is reincarnated is because their soul still has a mission to fulfill in this world. And once that mission has been fulfilled, then the soul goes up and is refined to a higher level. And if it has to come down again, it comes down again for some other purpose. And so there is this concept of reincarnation and levels of spiritual achievement in the spiritual world itself. Not spiritual achievement. I mean, it's the spiritual achievement is accomplished down in this world, but that the soul gets that reward or attains that level of consciousness and higher existence in the spiritual world. So that's a very Jewish idea that we see another parallel between Eastern beliefs and Jewish beliefs. So again, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. There's even more to research. It's a very interesting book called The Eighth Day, The Hidden History of Jewish Contribution to Civilization. Almost seems like this the concept that I want to do with this podcast and eventually the book that will come out of Jews Did It First. It seems like I was beaten to it by this Shmuel Korinsky, who wrote this book. That was back in the 90s. I was 14 years old when he wrote it. I definitely want to get a copy of this book and check it out, and so should you, especially because I don't want to just redo his work. I would love it if I could, add something, or at least repackage some things. That would be really nice. So, as we see, as always on this program, when it comes to ancient Eastern mystical beliefs, Jews did it first. And now, the counter-missionary. All right, this is going to be one of the last counter-missionary segments. Only got a couple left here. Then we're going to move into controversial issues that Jewish thought tackles, which is very much in line with the concept of Jews did it first. We're going to discuss things like abortion, gun control, suicide, all sorts of things that are very hot-button issues, can sometimes be political, and we'll take a look at how Jewish thought has discussed these concepts throughout the ages. So today's counter-missionary segment is an intriguing one. Many missionaries use this quote from Jeremiah, which is a very intriguing quote, I will admit. It does say in Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 30 and 31, "Behold, the days come, says the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers, in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For as much as they broke my covenant, although I was Lord over them, says the Lord." And verse 32 continues, "But this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I'll put my law in their inward parts, and in their heart I will write it, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." So this is a very interesting verse. And then verse 33 goes on to say that, he'll forgive their iniquity and all this kind of stuff. Certainly when we see the concept new covenant, or as Christians might like to translate it, New Testament. In fact, the Bibles that they print to missionize to Jews and the Jews for Jesus movement and so on, Messianic Jews, is they call the New Testament Brit Chadashah, which quite literally means new covenant. And so this is clearly a reference to this exact passage, the Hebrew, where he says, "I'll make a new covenant." Hashem says, "Ucharati, I will cut at Beit Israel, at Beit Yehuda, with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, Berit Chadashah, a new covenant, a new testament, as it were." And it makes us think, and it says not like the one that I had in Egypt. So maybe there seems to be this thing going on where the law that was given to them, right? What happened when they came out of Egypt? They went to Mount Sinai and they got the Torah. They got all these laws. So it seems to be that this is a new thing going on over here. This should also be made known that if you just read a couple chapters, just 2 chapters later in chapter 33, he's talking about when the Messiah comes, that there's going to be, he talks about the Messiah coming, a shoot from David and so on, and that there will still be priests. He will not cut off the priests, and there will be offerings and sacrifices and so on. So that doesn't seem to lend much credence to this concept that when he says a new covenant is going to be brought, that it means that it's the end of the law. Because if that's the case, then why would we have sacrifices and such being brought? I mean, isn't that the Christian argument that once Jesus comes, he's the final sacrifice. He's it. As we see the new covenant, and it's going to be a new law, not like the old law. It's going to be on your hearts and so on. So what is going on here? And in fact, this verse in Jeremiah is telling us a brand new thing, a brand new way of doing things that didn't exist before, and it's going to mean an end to the law, really flies in the face of a lot of other biblical passages. Not just, most obviously, you just read a couple more chapters in Jeremiah, and we've got it going on. But you look in Ezekiel 11, Ezekiel 37, Ezekiel 44, it's all over the place. In Isaiah, it talks about this, when the Messiah comes, that there will be going up to the temple and learning from God's law. Zechariah talks about this. Malachi talks about this. It's in Psalms. It's all over the place that when the Messiah comes, it's not going to be this new law, this new covenant, out with the old, in with the new. No, it's going to be a continuation. And in fact, we look in the Bible itself. You look in the Torah itself, the 5 books of Moses. In Deuteronomy especially, we have some very interesting passages where it mentions the eternality of the law, that it's going to go on forever. In Deuteronomy 29, verse 28 or 29, depending on how the Christian translation, the things that are revealed belong to us and our children forever, that we may do all the words of the law. In Psalms, the works of his hands are truth and justice, and all his commandments are sure. They stand fast forever and ever. Psalm 19, the laws of the Lord are perfect. It's a far cry from this broken system that seems to end in Jeremiah chapter 31. And they come with this contention that, it's so hard to do because the law was impossible. So I actually remember in college when I was first kind of coming back into Judaism, and I asked a friend of mine who was Catholic, who's probably a priest now. I think he was going to seminary to be a priest. I'm sure he's a priest out there somewhere these days. I said, so why? I don't understand. Like, why would God give this law just to say, psych, you couldn't do it, fooled you, it didn't work, and then here's the Messiah to come and take it away from you. And so I think his response was something to the effect of, to show them that they couldn't do it, because if God would have just done it right away, so they would say, why didn't you give us a chance or something? We could have done your law or something along those lines, that it was to show people how impossible it was to be godly without the sacrifice of God's Son, and et cetera, et cetera. That's an interesting concept, because if you again, look in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 14, but the word is very near to you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it. A few verses before that, it says, this commandment which I command you this day is not too hard for you, neither is it too far off. It's not in heaven that you should say, who's going to go up for us into heaven and bring it to us and make us hear it, that we may do it. Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who shall go over the sea for us and bring it to us and make us to hear it, that we may do it. No, the word is very near to you, in your mouth and your heart, that you may do it. It doesn't seem like it's too hard at all. I will say, there's a Yiddish expression, es ist schwer zu sein a Yid. It's difficult to be a Jew. That's true. It is very difficult, also because there's a lot of oppression. But yes, the law is difficult. Of course. Of course. No one said it was going to be a cakewalk. And interestingly enough, in the Christian Bible, in Romans chapter 10, he doesn't mistranslate, but he just cuts off an entire part of the verse. He says the word is near to you, in your mouth and in your heart. Period. Full stop. Well, what happened to that you may do it? Well, because that goes against the whole contention that it's difficult. So, using Jeremiah 31 to say, there's going to be this new covenant, the law is not going to apply anymore, it's going to be this whole new system going on. that doesn't really cut it. Doesn't really seem to mesh with the entirety of Jewish scripture, both in the Torah itself as well as the prophets and in the writings and Psalms and so forth. It just doesn't seem to work. So again, Christians want to claim that this is their belief and this is the new system and so on and so forth. That's fine. That's great. You go right ahead and believe that, but it doesn't seem, from my perspective, that you could use the Jewish Bible in order to prove that stance. Speaking of God's law given at Mount Sinai, I want to leave you with a short Torah thought about this week's Parsha. It's called Parshas Mishpatim, which means rules or laws. And it starts out, Ve'ela Mishpatim, and these are the rules, so on and so forth that God's giving. And it's brought down in commentators that why does it say, and these are the laws? Because Eile, these, when it says that, it means to contradict what came before, right? So and so, such and such happens, Ella, but this, or these things are different. When it says Eile, and these, it means it's connected. So just like we had Parshas Yisro, where we had the giving of the Torah, here we have a bunch of laws that are civil laws in nature, and we want to say even these were given by God on Mount Sinai. Now, you may think, well, wait a minute, I mean, isn't that obvious? I mean, we're talking about the Torah here, isn't all the Torah given at Mount Sinai? Well, the difference is these laws are very civil in nature. Civil law, there's tort law, and we might think, well, this is just sort of basic running of human civilization. In fact, lots of civilizations have very similar laws, which I'll actually address on a future episode of Jews Did It First, the concept of our civil law and how it's influenced modern day law. But it doesn't seem to be anything supernatural or God-given. It's just, laws on how communities and societies and civilizations function. So you might think, well, this is just stuff that makes sense, and of course it's in there, but not necessarily is it particularly godly. Well, in comes this one little letter, this vav in the beginning, which means and. That one little nuisance of a letter, just a little line, and says, no. This too is something godly. This too is something supernatural. And so don't think that when you're doing a mitzvah that makes sense, even if it's another mitzvah that makes sense to you, let's say it's not about, returning lost things or whatever it happens to be, it's some other sensible mitzvah for some reason that makes sense to you. Even if you want to say, the Sabbath, Shabbos makes sense because, you need a day of rest and you have to connect, you have to have a spiritual rejuvenation. Okay, but the truth is, we don't do mitzvahs because they make sense. Ve'ela mishpatim. These rules, these laws that make sense, mishpatim are a kind of rule, a kind of law that is intellectually understandable. There's three types of laws. You have mishpatim, which are these intellectual ones. You have edus, which are testimonies that don't make sense up front, but they have some, some memorial reason to them, like Passover. We wouldn't think to just eat a bunch of flat bread and kill ourselves for a week when it comes to our diet. But when you understand the story, the Exodus of Egypt, and they ate the matzah coming out, okay, so it makes sense to us that we do it, and so on and so forth. And then you have what are called the chukim, the laws that don't make sense at all. Those are just the statutes, like don't eat milk and meat together. Why? Well, because God said so. These mishpatim, ve'ela mishpatim, don't think that it makes sense to you, so that's why we're doing it. No. Why do we do everything it is that we do? Because it is godly, because it is spiritual. And even when we're doing something that seems mundane, since it is ordained by God in the Torah, it becomes a spiritual act. So everything you do, it says in the Torah, B'chol darkecha dayehu, you should know him in all of your ways. Everything you do, even the simplest things, you should have in mind that you're doing it for God, that you are connecting your soul to a higher spiritual plane of existence. And that is what makes us a godly people. Thank you so much for listening. I love to keep in touch, so please feel free to continue the conversation with me on the Facebook page at Jews Did It First, or you can email me, rabbi@jewishoswego.org. I'm also on Twitter @OswegoRabbi. Until next week, Shabbat Shalom.